Welcome to today's program. I'm Tom Bettinger, and I attend church on the Sabbath with the Church of God International in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Now, I mentioned Sabbath, and I'll pose a quick question for you. Why do most professing Christians attend church on Sunday? Interesting question, because most of them do attend on Sunday. However, there are some, like myself, who come together on Saturday or the Sabbath to worship. Why is that? And with that question in mind, the question also becomes, if it's not the Sabbath and if it became Sunday, how did that happen? Or, putting it the other way, if it is that most people use Sunday and it should be the Sabbath, why do they keep Sunday instead? Interesting questions, and I'd like you, if you have your Bible, to open it up to the Old Testament, where it describes the Sabbath in terms of what God is expecting for us on that particular day. And it's one of those 10 commandments that comes up in both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. But for the moment, let's turn to Exodus 20, and we'll start in verse 8. This is the fourth of the 10 commandments that God gave to ancient Israel. And beginning in verse 8 of Exodus 20, it says the following: "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy," to keep it separate, a special purpose, to keep it holy. Verse 9, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God, the Sabbath of God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. God made it special. God made it holy as something special, as opposed to the first 6 days, something separate from those 6 days. Now, you might say, okay, well, that was for the Jews, and the Jews still practice that, but does it have applicability to Christians today, those who follow Jesus Christ? Let's move over, if you would, now to the companions series of scriptures in Deuteronomy 5, also talking about the Sabbath within the 10 commandments themselves. And beginning in verse 12 of Deuteronomy 5, it says the following: "Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work within those 6 days." Verse 14, "But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God, the Sabbath of God. It is not the Sabbath of the Jews." Continuing, "In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates." So is it just of the Jews, the strangers, the non-Israelites at the time? They're also to observe this Sabbath. "Nor the stranger within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you." They are also to observe and rest from the work that they would do the first 6 days. Verse 15, "And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, as a result, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." It is a commandment of God to the people that he brought out from Egypt, the ancient nation of Israel. Does it have applicability to us today? Is it strictly, as many people would say, something that is done by the Jews? And God made a very large emphasis on the Sabbath as being something special, something holy, that would be a sign that would show his people, the ones that he was blessing, that he was guiding, versus the nations around them, the non-Israelites or the Gentiles, the strangers, as it would be called. And God made it it important that this day was special as opposed to the other 6 days. It was supposed to be a rest for the people to discontinue what they did the other 6 days, all the laborers, whether they were people who tended sheep versus people who grew grains versus the person who washed the clothes or cooked the food or whatever their particular occupation was. They were to stop after the 6th day, and during that 7th day, within the 7-day cycle, they were supposed to treat it as something special, something holy that God had set aside for them. And it was commanded that they do this. This 7th-day cycle has lasted through all this time. We still use a 7-day cycle in our calendar systems. Although we use different names by what these days are, what we would call today as Saturday is really, for the most part, the Sabbath, although it starts at the sundown of Friday evening going through the sundown of Saturday evening. So with this said, again, many Christians will actually keep Sunday and consider that to be the day that God has set aside for them to stop what they do and to worship Him. And this first day of the week, or as many would say, the 8th day of the week, the day after the Sabbath, they say that this is the day that we should observe. But why? If you ask most people why they keep the 8th day or Sunday as the day of worship, they may shrug their shoulder and say something like, well, my minister or my pastor is telling me that this is the day that I should keep. Well, okay, and many people will do that without checking for themselves. And others will say, well, the Sabbath was done away with because that was strictly for the Jews, and that we live in a new time under a new covenant, and we live under the grace of Jesus Christ, and that it has no applicability for us today. Well, is that true? Can we find evidence in the pages of our Bible to say that? And I'll pose you this question. If God established the Sabbath as the day to be hallowed and to set aside for His people each week to stop working, and not just His people, but the strangers within, even the people that work for them, even the people who were non-Israelites. People would call them just Jews today, but there's more to Israel than just the Jewish people themselves. Is that something, if He went through all that length to establish this day, why would He change it? Was there a reason for such a change to be made? Well, what has happened is that there's been a great deception. And we're warned about these deceptions in the pages of your Bible. If you would, let's move over to the New Testament and Matthew 24, and beginning in verse 4. This is Jesus Christ talking about what would happen. In verse 4 of Matthew 24, it says, "And Jesus answered to them, saying, Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and deceive many." Moving down to verse 11, "Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many." Is the idea that Sunday has replaced the Sabbath just one more example of this deception by people claiming to be representative of Jesus Christ, and yet what they're presenting is something not that God or Jesus Christ would authorize, but something that came from a different source? What do we believe? What do we look for from this deception? The Apostle John also warns of these deceivers. And if you would, to the epistle of 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 4 says the following, "He who says, I know him," and that being Jesus Christ, "and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him." If you do not keep His commandments, you are a liar. You are not a Christian because you're not obeying His word. Jesus Christ Himself said that to obey Him, you must do what? You must keep His commandments. John 14 and verse 15 says, this is quoting Jesus Christ, "If you love me, keep my commandments." think about that for the moment, and I need to take a short break for some literature offerings, and get yourself a pad and a pencil to write this information down, and I will be right back.
We'd like to offer you 2 booklets on today's program. We'd like to offer you the pamphlet, Did the Apostolic Church Observe the Sabbath and Holy Days? Yes, they did. Get this pamphlet and find the proof. We also want to offer you The Great Day of the Lord, a study of the book of Joel. This will give you detailed information on what the Day of the Lord is. To get both of these items free of charge, all you need to do is call toll-free 1-888-578-8791. That's 1-888-578-8791. Or you can order by visiting our website, www.cgi.org. That's www.cgi.org. If you'd like to attend services in Gaithersburg, Maryland, go to our local website, cgimaryland.org. That's cgimaryland.org. If you'd like to consult with Elder Mike James, please give him a call at 240-304-6798. That's 240-304-6798. Or shoot him an email at mhjames6043@yahoo.com. mhjames6043@yahoo.com. The Church of God International meets the first, second, and fourth Saturdays of each month at 1:45 p.m. in the Casey Community Center, 810 South Frederick Avenue, Gaithersburg, Maryland, 20877.
Hi, welcome back. Please call or write for that literature that was just offered. We'll give you another chance a little bit later in the show today. When I left off earlier, I talked about a quote, or I gave you a quote that was attributable to Jesus Christ himself in terms of, if we love him, what are we to do? And that was in John 14, verse 15. John chapter 14, verse 15 says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." This is quoting Jesus Christ. Now, what commandments was he talking about? Well, these are none other than the commandments that he personally gave to the patriarchs back in the Old Testament. A lot of people will say, well, that wasn't Jesus Christ, that was the Father. That was the old, very stern, very angry Father that came in the time of the Old Testament, and Jesus Christ had to come in the time of the New Testament to sort of clean things up and to change things. But is that true? Now, we don't have time for it today in today's show, but think about the following verse in John chapter 8. Having a conversation with the elders of the scribes and the Pharisees at the time, they were talking about how Moses was their father. And Jesus Christ said in verse 58 that before Moses was, I am. He identified himself as that God figure that spoke to, among other people, Moses in the Old Testament. He was the one that gave the instructions to, among others, Moses in the Old Testament. And this included the 10 Commandments, including that fourth one about the Sabbath day, to keep it holy and to observe it. It wasn't Jesus who then came and said, no, we're going to make a change. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So the Sabbath itself is in force. And just to prove it one more time, let's go to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17, for those who think that Jesus Christ came to make a change. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 says the following, and this is Jesus Christ speaking. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. He came not to destroy the law or to change the law, but to magnify it, to fulfill, to add something that wasn't available or at least understood by most of the people that preceded him at that time. and that is the spiritual aspect. The Sabbath day itself has very much a spiritual aspect to it, just like other laws that we're giving, some of the Ten Commandments, for instance, adultery. It's not just the physical act of adultery that would be a sin, but if you had it in your mind to lust after another person carnally, that also is adultery. That is an example of fulfilling the law, filling up the spiritual aspect that most people did not understand before Jesus came on the earth as a human being. So with that said, getting back to the original idea, whatever happened to the Sabbath and whatever happened to the idea of Sunday replacing the Sabbath as the day that God had instructed us to keep as a special day, a holy day. Many Christians will use the term Lord's Day. I know that coming from a Roman Catholic background, they will use the term Lord's Day as equivalent to Sunday, and that is the day that we as Christians should keep. But is that true? And one of the areas where it says Lord's Day, let's go to the example in Revelation chapter 1. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 10 says the following. This is the Apostle John. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice as a trumpet. Well, does it say Lord's Day? Well, first off, that statement itself doesn't give us a whole lot, and it certainly doesn't give us anything that says, by the way, the day of observance is going to be changed from the Sabbath to the 8th day or Sunday. It certainly doesn't say that. But can we find other places where we find this Lord's Day? Believe it or not, we can, but not in the way you would think of. The Lord's Day, or more precisely, what would be called the Day of the Lord, is actually spoken of in many places in your Bible, in the Old Testament primarily, but also referenced in New Testament passages, including those of Revelation, talking about the end times and what will be the destiny of man in the age where man rules himself. I'll give you some examples here. And first, if you would, turn to Isaiah chapter 2. Isaiah chapter 2, for the day of the Lord of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty, upon everything lifted up, and it shall be brought low. Now, that in itself, this day of the Lord, does this sound like Sunday to you, or the 8th day? At this point, we really can't draw too much from that, but it does talk about coming upon people or everything that's proud and lofty, or the people that might be magnifying themselves. Let's go to another verse in Isaiah, and this time chapter 13. Isaiah chapter 13, verse 6 says the following. Wail, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. Did you hear that? The day of the Lord will come as destruction. Does this sound like it would be talking about Sunday or the 8th day? Let's go to another example, this time in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 46. Jeremiah 46, verse 10 says, for this is the day of the Lord of hosts, a day of vengeance, that he may avenge himself on his adversaries. Well, this is getting pretty heavy at this point. We're talking about a day of vengeance. We saw in Isaiah a day of destruction, a day of vengeance in Jeremiah. So what's going on here? Is this really talking about Sunday as replacing the Sabbath as a day of worship, or is it something much more? Let's move over to the book of Joel. Joel chapter 2 this time, 2 verses there. First, verse 11 says the following. The Lord gives voice before his army, for his camp is very great. For strong is the one who executes his word. For the day of the Lord is great and very terrible. Who can endure it? This can't be talking about Sunday. And if this is the justification for the Lord's Day as a replacement for Sabbath, somebody's very mistaken. Again, verse 31 in Joel says, the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. Friends, we're talking about something completely different here. This is not talking about Sunday worship at all. It can't be. Let's go for more proof here. The book of Amos. Go to another writer here. Amos, one of the smaller books in your Bible, chapter 5, verse 20. It says, "Is not the day of the Lord darkness and not light? Is it not very dark with no brightness in it?" This cannot be Sunday. You know, the sun being bright. We're not talking about the same thing at all here. Another book in your Bible toward the end of the Old Testament, Zephaniah. Zephaniah, the first chapter in verse 14 says, "The great day of the Lord is near. It is near and hastens quickly. The noise of the day of the Lord is bitter. There the mighty men shall cry out." We're certainly not talking about Sunday here. And finally, in Malachi, verse 5 of chapter 4, Malachi 4, verse 5 says, "Behold, I send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." Friends, we're obviously not talking about this Lord's Day being a substitute for the Sabbath called Sunday. It's not even close. So does this sound like a replacement? I don't think so. So I want you to ponder on that, and I'm going to take another break here, and we're going to offer that literature once more to you. Have your pen and paper, write it down, and I will be back in a few moments.
We'd like to offer you 2 booklets on today's program. We'd like to offer you the pamphlet, "Did the Apostolic Church Observe the Sabbath and Holy Days?" Yes, they did. Get this pamphlet and find the proof. We also want to offer you The Great Day of the Lord, a study of the book of Joel. This will give you detailed information on what the day of the Lord is. To get both of these items free of charge, all you need to do is call toll-free 1-888-578-8791. That's 1-888-578-8791. Or you can order by visiting our website, www.cgi.org. That's www.cgi.org. If you'd like to attend services in Gaithersburg, Maryland, go to our local website, cgimaryland.org. That's cgimaryland.org. If you'd like to consult with Elder Mike James, please give him a call at 240-304-6798. That's 240-304-6798. Or shoot him an email at mhjames6043@yahoo.com. mhjames6043@yahoo.com. The Church of God International meets the first, second, and fourth Saturdays of each month at 1:45 p.m. in the Casey Community Center, 810 South Frederick Avenue, Gaithersburg, Maryland, 20877.
Hi, welcome back. If you have a chance, please write or call for that literature after the program today. As we conclude today's program, just a reminder of what we've gone through. We looked to this concept of the Lord's Day, and what did it mean? In the book of Revelation, first chapter, it talked about the Lord's Day as something John was envisioned during this Lord's Day. It doesn't give us much more description as far as what the Lord's Day meant at that point, but if you go to other scriptures in your Bible, and remember what Jesus did when he encountered the devil when he was trying to tempt him, when the devil was trying to tempt Jesus in Matthew 4:4 and Luke 4:4, quoting the Old Testament, he says, "We live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God," your Bible. So we went to the Old Testament to find these references to what might be considered the Lord's Day, or more accurately, the Day of the Lord. The Day of the Lord is not a substitute for the Sabbath and calling it Sunday and making that the day of worship. Try as they may, people cannot find a justification within the pages of your Bible that says that Sunday is the new day of worship instead of the Sabbath. The Old Testament writers knew what they were doing by the inspiration of God to write down the verses which said very distinctly that the seventh day, the Sabbath, is the day for rest. if it was going to be an issue, wouldn't you think you would see more or anything at all in the pages of your New Testament that said that this day was replaced? People will also try to say that, well, the Lord was risen on a Sunday morning and therefore that's why we keep it. Try as you may, going through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when the women came to the tomb, guess what? He was already gone. He wasn't risen that morning. He had already been risen the afternoon before on the Sabbath day. People actually follow what had happened, not through the pages of the Bible, but from ancient pagan religions, those that preceded Christianity by many years, and they follow in those traditions. Sunday worship, think about it, Sunday. They're worshiping the sun, and yet many Christians today think that's what they need to do. I hope this was a good lesson for you, and I ask you to look through your pages of your Bible and study for yourself. Thanks again for being with us today, and hope to see you soon.